Everybody, Jason Burmis here, and we've got a very special show for you right now. I was listening to the Last American Vagabond podcast on my journey back from Iowa into New York before I knew a contact tracing task force was going to be deployed here, which is just a whole lot of wacky. And there were just so many things that Ryan, the founder of the Last American Vagabond.com, was going over that I think are important, especially in regards to the CDC, the isolation of this virus, the bills that are already in government in New York State, some of which we've covered on this program. And to wrap it all together, this transhumanist push that keeps moving forward no matter who is in office, whether or not you get Trump or you get Zombie Joe, that DARPA initiative, okay, is going to keep pushing forward. So I want to thank my guest first and foremost for joining me. Ryan, how are you today, sir?
I'm good, Jason. Thanks for having me on, brother, and thanks for showing some solidarity while that was going on. It's an interesting situation, the censorship aspect of that.
Yeah, and you know what? Let's talk about that as well. As we get into this. By the way, you can follow him over at TLAV Vagabond. So that's there. And of course, you can go check him out at thelastvagabond.com. But Ryan was fully demonetized probably about a month before I was fully demonetized. We're working on, I think next week will be 5 full months since I was demonetized, so it's got to be about 6 months for you. We reviewed it here live on air. We still have not gotten any kind of a response yet. I'm deemed harmful content, yet 13 of my last 15 videos beforehand were actually remonetized through their automated system that they act like as a human being, but we all know that it's not. It's all selective enforcement. So, guys, if you want to support me through the GoFundMe. How can they support you, Ryan?
Direct support, same kind of way, just different platforms. I know right now that Patreon is getting, and rightly so, get in a bad way. But however you want to do so, it's direct support. And I guess maybe you could argue Patreon is not necessarily direct, but, I have a P.O. box now that you can send checks directly to, or you can simply just send notes of support. But, Patreon, Subscribestar, they're all listed below the videos. My point is I recommend, as Jason is saying as well, is that you stop supporting through other platforms like these social media controllers and go directly to, go to Jason's GoFundMe or whichever one you're using and support him directly. Subscribe to his websites and his concepts. That's what it's really about. And that's how I want you to support T-Lab is go to my website, subscribe more than anything else. And then if you want to support us, then you can reach out through those channels.
And guys, I apologize for the reverb on him. I just updated XSplit, and there was a certain setting that was not on. Hopefully we're better now. Okay, awesome. Fantastic. I was wondering why that was going on. All right, you can also see us both over at rockfin.com, and as I've told you guys, aside from the exclusive you'll get free, we live stream every Tuesday at noon. This is where I'll be if they kick me off. This will be the first place that I'm actually posting and live streaming on a regular basis. You can create a free account, and if you do decide to support one of us, you get all of our content. That's what's really cool about this. It is like a Netflix for content creators. That being said, let's just start getting into it, right? Now, here we are, almost 6 months after all of this. My town is now a hot spot, not only in New York, but making national news. They have said they're sending a COVID SWAT team. This is their own words. 105 people have tested positive, apparently, so far, out of 3,000 plus. And so far, we have one person with a 105-degree fever. Everybody else either has no symptoms at all, or is completely asymptomatic, or extremely mild. And yet, they're now deploying not only the team of 70 contact tracers, but 3 separate testing centers where the people who are most in fear, and there are plenty of them here, I promise you that, will now go take this 15-minute PCR test that is known to have faulty results. And we haven't even isolated the virus, according to the CDC. I mean, thoughts on all of that?
Yeah, I mean, the first part, it kind of gives a whole new spin to swatting someone, doesn't it? Right now that you can essentially, I mean, before it was dangerous because, as many may know, the term swatting is essentially, it's a pretty disgusting tactic where people can fake calls about people doing violent acts, and they show up with a SWAT team, and people get shot sometimes when they're not even, the person who made the call was doing it just to play a joke or whatever. So now add the technocratic authoritarian state to that, and the idea that there can come in and put you on 14-day quarantine based on hypothetical. Like, what if somebody calls and says, "Hey, I saw them doing this or that"? Like, they're going to err on the side of caution. Like, we see where it's going. That just blows my mind that it was there beforehand, and now it's even more alarming. But the big part of all of that for me is rightly what you said there. And this is something that is still being aggressively disagreed with. And it's more semantics than anything, is that this hasn't been isolated. And that's in regard to, and look, I'll put right off the bat the caveat that there's a lot of discussion that Koch's postulates, which is the gold standard up until now in regard to deciding whether or not that's what's actually causing the disease, whether the correlation between the two, that there's a lot of people now that are saying, well, for a long time now, we've been discussing that Koch's postulates aren't actually, correct, or however we would phrase that we should be looking into something new. So that's fair. But I argue that that's something, it's nonetheless still the gold standard and has been up until this point. So that's been in a conversation, but we still have that. And so going into this, we can see very clearly, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that they did not meet Koch's postulates to prove that this is what we're dealing with. And I mean, multiple studies verbatim said that, although we didn't meet this, we've decided this, and so on. And as I think you were referencing, the CDC, and then posted on the FDA website, said kind of quietly at the bottom that they don't have qualified isolates. And this is basic stuff. So knowing that, we need to ask the question is, can we then make a vaccine? Can we test for something we've never proven is even there? And these are not questions to say that we know that's not happening, but we should be asking these questions. This is the frustrating part. And then the PCR side of that, as you also pointed out, is that the PCR test is verifiably faulty. It doesn't mean that it couldn't be used, but there's a guaranteed false positive aspect to this that we're all finding out now. Even though people in the beginning, for instance, the one I mentioned was a guy who was working with, the PCR test in regard to working with muscles. And for people that don't know it, it basically, it's in regard to genetic material. And so he used the PCR test with these muscles forever, and he got constant false positives. Still found it useful. But when this all started, he spoke out and said, why are we using this? It's out of control. And now the point is that it's okay if they want to err on the side of caution. You just can't use those verifiably inaccurate numbers to put people on lockdown, to arrest someone for not meeting some kind of unjust already mandate in regard to those numbers. I mean, I can go off on this forever, but there's so many parts of these things at the bottom line that boil down to it's not accurate, and we're seeing that verifiably now. So going into the next part is all the, what they're doing because of it, which I'm sure we're going to get into, the lockstep concept and the parasite stress theory. And it makes me wonder, and we should be asking whether or not all of this is leading to that, intentionally so, lies and all. That's how I would see it.
Well, let's talk about it for a second, because if you actually look all the way back to March, right, what was the real gold standard of testing for this thing to see if people had it or had it aggressively? They were doing CAT scans of lungs, and that began in China, but it was also used in Europe. There has never been discussion of that in this country. And the one video that I had pulled this year, and I appealed it, and they still pulled it, I didn't get a strike for it, was me commenting on Dr. Cameron Siddell. And you put a small clip of him in that last broadcast that I was discussing before that today. And basically he was just saying that this is not ARDS, and talking about what happened to the lungs during and after the cytokine storm, and also warning people that these ventilators, if continue to be used, we're going to continue to kill 80 to 90% of the people on them. And that was before the mainstream media talked about it, later confirmed by authoritative sources. But the facts aren't the facts. And that's where we're going with this, right? So now we've never done that. Okay. They did not pre-test any of these students that were coming back at this private college, or I'm sorry, at the SUNY college here. But they did pre-test everybody at the private college, which is about 2,000. So they're literally right next to each other. They're not a mile away. I mean, you could throw a baseball from one campus to the other across the street. And they all tested. So now you have one person. And by the way, they haven't even confirmed whether or not the initial people who were symptomatic that they tested actually popped hot. But it gave them this carte blanche to test kids at parties. And they knew they were coming from Long Island, and they were coming from New York City, and they didn't test prior. So they knew they were going to get these positive results. In my mind, this is the beginning of lockdown 2. Now, bars and restaurants, as the contact tracers come in, because my town is so small that every single business on Main Street will be affected. They already shut down, Ryan, my bar that I was running before I got back into this, and a hazmat team was already in there to disinfect it, and they don't know when they're going to be able to do this. Is as dystopian and Orwellian and weird for me as it gets, but this is now the reality, and they have put it into a system where people think that they're going back to normal, but they're preaching a new normal. Sleepy Joe, Zombie Joe, Puppet Joe, Joey B, whatever you want to call him, has already said that first time they took him out of the basement, he wants 100,000 contact tracers, not only for COVID-19 84, but other illnesses as well. And that kind of gets us into lockstep, where they talk about, even when this is over, and folks, again, if you look at the numbers and you look at that slope down, we've more than beaten and flattened the curve across the nation. Okay? Cases don't mean hospitalizations, and they certainly don't mean deaths. Those are way, way down. That they do go to this new normal of authoritarianism and a parental-like control. And they've already talked to us, Ryan, like children for decades, ramping it up year after year, heavier and heavier. So I guess the question is, how much of this looks like that Rockefeller indoctrination document?
Yeah, and that's the alarming part about it. As you know, it's damn near exactly what's happening, and that's it's interesting. It's important to think historically here as well how many times that's happened, because you could argue that one kind of such, where we have a simulation and it turns out to be exactly what happens. That's possible, although ridiculously mathematically, like, it's just extreme. But yet over and over, 9/11 and on, in the UK had many of all these. This happens over and over and over, right? And now, even just with COVID-19 specifically, we've seen numerous times. COVID 201, it's exactly the same thing. So here we are with another scenario back in 2010, where they write out this document, the Rockefeller Foundation, and it's what's so alarming about it is that it's talking about creating a situation based on a pandemic. Now, whether or not it's real, the point is that people will push back, and they actually write about that, and then write about how we need to be put back in our place. Yet freedom and democracy, right? Like, how can you all simultaneously argue that you're doing all of this for the betterment of us, and yet that literally outline in the document that because we're aware that we don't want to be in this bad situation, that you have to force us back into it? It's just crazy, as well as the idea of the pandemic and the whole thing. But before we go further, I wanted to make a couple notes on some things you had said before in regard to all of the things that have been developing. And it's so incredible, because the interesting thing about the numbers you pointed out is, yeah, it's incredible. We can see that, particularly in the UK and places like that, the deaths are damn near non-existent. It's gone. And yet the cases spike up, the case-demic, because they're testing with this test, which they've admitted is faulty. So even those numbers that show basically zero deaths are still also using faulty data, which you could argue could be erring on the side of not showing you cases. But by and large, we can see that that's not the case. So it basically just recently they've been coming out. We've, heard that about 6% of people, all said and done, actually had only COVID-19 without comorbidities. That's a really alarming thing to realize, as well as the New York Times just reported that some upwards of 90% of everyone that took this PCR test had, this is their quote, barely any virus. So the point being is that the upwards of 90% could have not actually been sick, because you can have it in your system. That's what the PCR test is. That's one of the problems. You can test for it, but not actually be transmissible or even sick. So and all of these things have been popping up right now. So it's interesting. It's almost like they're retroactively trying to get in front of the work that people like you and other independent media have been doing, and kind of dripping these things out. Weirdly, though, not stopping the progression into it, shifting into 2020 and all that. So back to the lockstep part of this, it's so incredibly alarming when you tie it in with the idea of multiple studies that have been done about what's called the parasite stress theory. Derek Brose wrote about this fantastically in actually 2 different articles now. The second one ties it in with lockstep. And for those that haven't seen it, this is a theory about, and it's pretty clearly demonstrated by numerous locations, that places in the world that are more prevalent to pandemics have incredibly higher prevalence of authoritarian governments and conformity to those governments. And then it also goes into the idea that if a government wanted to create something like that, a pandemic has a empirically unique, that's their term, effect in driving those exact things. And then it goes on to point out that even if it wasn't real, it makes no difference. meaning that your government could fake a pandemic and drive you into an authoritarian government position with conformity. And it also discusses how it's people informing on each other and holding other people and their neighbors accountable to the government only when a pandemic is in place. So the question we should be asking is whether or not this is something they created to do that, because we know they do their research. We know they're aware of this, or at the very least using it now because it's happening. There's 100 other directions in the lockstep. You tell me what you want to talk about with all this. It's pretty crazy alarming. The technocratic part, I'm sure, is a focus here, but you tell me where you want to go on this.
Well, let's talk about what's happening right now. You just talked about the modern day brown shirts, and they are now here. These contact tracers are there for just about anything, because let me make it clear. People wanted to go back to school in New York, but they were so scared because they didn't want to send their small child into some slave environment where when they sneeze, they're going to be isolated. And then if they, again, pop hot for this thing that has never really been isolated. And again, I want to make it very clear. I think this thing is absolutely real. And if you look at it now from the fact that you had China initially say this is a U.S. bioweapon, Iran, who had high casualties within their government, and by the way, not necessarily the same thing, especially because they've never isolated it, right? Different strains, forget about mutations, but if this is some kind of a predator class operation, you have that here. And to me, it was in the U.S. November, latest, probably before November, and then it was acknowledged later because it was the weakest of the strains. And if you look at the flu that we were actually combating, what was it? H1N1 was influenza B. What they had tried to scare everybody else about in 2009. We had already had a very hardcore flu season, and now they've blurred the line so much that any illness that looks like this will be accepted as this, and the contact tracers are now in your life. If they show up to my door, Ryan, it's immediately get out of here. Like, I'm going to tell you once to leave, and then I'm going to start filming you, and I'm going to put you on blast. And if you need to get law enforcement to come arrest me, good thing it's a catch and release state now, because you're going to process me, and you're going to let me go, because I'm having nothing to do with you, and I'm going to sue everybody. This is
the door. That's where I'm at today.
Yeah. I mean, I'm going to be going around. They're going to put these test sites up. They're going to visit every single one of these businesses. We live in a small Kevin Bacon-like community that it will be impossible for them not to infiltrate every aspect of life here in this small town. That is 100% going to happen, and that's why they called it a SWAT team. This is a beta test to see how the rest of Middle America will handle it, as New York is a beta test for what they want to do with the rest of the country. The man has given this state to the contact tracing team of Michael Bloomberg, the re-education team of Bill and Melinda Gates, and the rest to Eric Schmidt, while real estate plummets in New York. But guess who's moving in? One of their other billionaire buddies, Jeff Bezos, with Amazon and his Automation Nation. This is all right here in front of you. And let's talk about that parental control, right? Because as they eviscerate the middle class, they've already done it, and do it even further, right? They're already devaluing the dollar by, just putting a huge amount of currency, demonizing cash everywhere, only accepting cards. Many of these payments are direct deposits, getting you used to that and gearing you up for a UBI. And if you and I don't want to take it because we don't want the mandatory vaccine or whatever else you have to do with it, we'll be $12,000 to $20,000 behind these people. I mean, I really see that developing rather quickly, and that's how they're going to sell this authoritarianism, this parentalism. I mean, we're already seeing commercials on Amazon where some Asian woman believes she's a hero because she's taking the infrared temperature of slave employees on a floor that in 10 years will be dominated by Automation Nation robotics.
Yeah, it's this whole point is very alarming that we're at a point now where these contact tracers are basically, and by the way, some of these people that I've talked to have 2-3 days of training, if not a week, or it depends on where you talk to. But in California, there's people that had 2 online training classes and then one something else, and then they were on basically ready to go. And these are just individuals with their own political drives and everything else, which is going to influence their actions. It's kind of alarming. But it's an interesting point you make about the money, because it's very clear that they're playing this game of semantics as well with the idea of mandatory, right? Well, it's not going to be, we're not going to force you to take it, except we're going to use things like social isolation, financial isolation, the idea where you're not allowed to do exclusion, rather. You're not allowed to participate in these things if you don't have what you're supposed to have, but it's not mandatory, right? So it's interesting to see that that's going to exclude you. But then the money thing is interesting. You're right, is we're talking about, that you have to prove that you're doing what you're supposed to before you get that, even though there shouldn't be some kind of a, what you have to prove to be able to get the money to survive, essentially. If you think about how crazy that is right now, that it's all driving you in the same direction. And this is about something that we all should know by now is untested, other than a very preliminary stuff, completely experimental. And nonetheless, it's all coming out. And you mentioned the 2009 swine flu discussion. That's incredibly relevant right now, as well as the 70s. More than once, they've lied to us about one of these pandemics and forced out vaccinations, right? And so how in the world can we not be allowed to talk about that right now? That's what's so incredibly alarming, is they're also censoring around this whole big thing. But I think that the whole technocratic point of all of this, and I think this is why they're pivoting into 2020 and the shootings and everything else. I mean, most of these mainstream outlets don't even have coronavirus topics on the main page anymore. It's because they want to pretend like it's a foregone conclusion. Well, we've all decided that we're all in danger, so we all know that we need to take actions for our safety. I mean, most of us don't think like that. So what we need is people like you and people like us in the independent media to, stand up, say something, make sure, look at the Berlin protests and all these people that are standing up and marching about this stuff. That's what we need to be doing, because this is not going to stop. It's quite alarming.
Yeah, no, it's not going to stop. And that's where I want to move this forward to. So let's talk about Trump, Operation Warp Speed, the convalescent plasma treatment that he approved about a week and a half ago, and how all these things tie in. Because if you look at, his initial response with the hydroxychloroquine, for instance, as demonized as that has become, and I want to make this real clear, it's not approved by the WHO or the CDC or the FDA, but here you have a Yale epidemiologist who has over 300 peer-reviewed papers pointing to other peer-reviewed papers that, yes, this Zithromax, zinc, and aerosolized steroid treatments actually work. Now we know we're allowed to say remdesivir works. Sure, it costs $10 in raw materials for 10 days of it, and they're going to charge you $2,000 to $5,000 for that treatment. Sure, but they also admit that dextromethasone works. Okay, dextromethasone is their approved steroid treatment. Now I want to know if any of these 105 positive tests, since this is so deadly, are on any of that. And the fact of the matter is, we kind of already know that they are not on that, and most of these people go fully untreated. So, Number one, we've avoided treating this thing now for 5 to 6 months. Let's be quite honest with ourselves, except when you saw a doctor and you had money, and they were able to be honest with you, like Bartlett in Texas with his budesonide, or if you go to the story to even Brendan Schaub and how this is not headline news, well, we know why it's not. He contracts coronavirus, and his doctor actually asks his political leanings. And he goes, why does that matter? And he's like, well, there's some people who on the left don't want to take the hydroxychloroquine, but I'm going to tell you it's what I would prescribe to you. And he did. And 4 days later, Brendan Schaub was just fine. Okay, but that doesn't make any media whatsoever. Yet, with Operation Warp Speed and these 150 vaccine trials that obviously after Trump put that out there knew he was going to be pushed into no matter what. You have Bill Gates, who's the main media proponent of this entire thing, saying on camera, we don't know if they'll work. We don't know if they'll work to stop transmission. We don't know if they'll work to lower the mortality rate. And this is while he talks tongue-in-cheek about the Moderna tests, the fact that 80% had side effects, 100% of the people that had the hot dose. The study showed 20% were actually hospitalized. They say all this on camera while he tells you he wants to lock you down till 2022. And at best, you will produce antibodies for several weeks to several months that they hope will lower a mortality rate that at best, by the WHO standards, is 0.6%. Now, you say it like that to somebody, and it's almost like it can't click because that can't be true. But that is exactly what they are pushing. And now this convalescent plasma treatment that's already out there claims to do nothing more than what? Give you the antibodies. So why is that not even a discussion? How is it that you can put all that information to a certain group of people, but they are so hardcore into identity politics on this at this point that if I say that, you're a MAGA guy.
Right. Right. That's what's it's obnoxious about this the two-party paradigm scenario. I mean, look, you should, at the end of the day, and this is why I've tried to avoid the whole treatment discussion for the most part, not because it's not relevant, but because it's so more convoluted than most others. I mean, right now, really, that's what we're doing. We're arguing about which big pharma drug is better. Like, that's crazy that they pushed you into that, pushed us into that conversation. But it should be that you pick what you think, right? If you're in a position where you're in danger, at the end of the day, same argument they've made about cannabis all these years, right? Why would you not be able to try something if you're going to die, or you think you're in a position where they go, look, we can't do anything else, so let me try whatever the hell I want to try, right? I mean, it's my body, my choice, right? We've heard that for our whole lives. So the point is that, interestingly enough, more recently, I found a video actually this morning, and I've been researching this more on my own time. It's pretty clear that hydroxychloroquine definitely has effects and definitely is something that can work in this regard. And it's just ridiculous that they're playing this game. And I think it's pretty obviously stupid that, the one that costs more is the one that it's like big surprise, right? But I also want to caution that just because, let's say, Trump or anybody else is saying, you should use this, and they say, no, you shouldn't, doesn't automatically boil down to Trump good guy, they're bad guy. Like, that's always, we have to also realize that they know we look at these things. And I don't think this is even the case, but consider that was the ploy in order to make you think that that's the case, right? That he is fighting for you. And I don't think that's the reality. But at the end of the day, I think it's ridiculous and obvious that they're blocking things like these treatments. Even arresting doctors for prescribing them. Think about how incredible that is, and there are plenty of experts that are telling you right now that they've had an outstanding effect with hydroxychloroquine and zinc specifically. And, that should be something we're allowed to hear. And, but you were going to say something. I was going to jump onto the Operation Warp Speed.
Well, before we get to Warp Speed, I just want to point out that, you had Louis Gohmert, who tested positive, right? This is a guy that's in Congress. He gets what? Hydroxychloroquine, Zithromax, zinc, the inhaled steroids, aka the budesonide or something similar, and he tests positive for the antibodies after the fact and is totally fine and actually donates to this convalescent plasma treatment. That's not in the news. That's not even really on the quote-unquote right-wing network, Fox News. And my point from the very beginning of this is that, if we're going to defeat this, we're going to have to have treatments that work outside of vaccinations and get those out to people. And, of course, that is just simply not the narrative. So that now brings us in to this Operation Warp Speed, where we finally had a journalist out in the Columbia Journalism Review not only confirm that Gates is indeed invested in Gilead and other vaccine companies, but really illustrates that he's at least $250 million deep in influencing the media on top of it, Ryan.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's damning. Good for them too. That's always what you should recognize in the mainstream. Is it's not that if it's in mainstream that it's automatically false, or vice versa. I would argue even with that article, there's probably something in there that's being driven to a certain agenda or so. But nonetheless, everything in there is accurate. And for those that believe that because it's in the mainstream, it makes it more valid, well, there you go. And by the way, that's basically the stuff that Derek was writing about in his 3-part series that was labeled absurd conspiracy theory, right? And it's just so ridiculous that it can be so clearly pointed out. This guy is aggressively influencing the media through his foundation and otherwise, and that, especially as your other point, talking about forced vaccination, right? So you're talking about even whether societally, financially, or actually mandatory. Yet you pointed out that there are treatments that are showing all kinds of effects, including the thing that they're claiming the vaccine might not even do. And yet they're still just going right over that and saying, we'll never go back to normal until we get the vaccine. There's an agenda there, and it has to be clear to us, like a lot of these experts are now saying. And even more alarming in all of that to Operation Warp Speed is that this is something that is driven by the Trump administration. So I don't understand how this, the game is always on, and this applies to both sides, by the way, as always. Trump just happens to be the president. That on regard to Trump and his supporters, they're I would argue predominantly, skeptical about vaccines, right? And so here we come in with this program, and the argument is either that, well, it's a 4D chess move. He's doing it to trick people, or that somewhere in that he's using it to call out the other people, or it's because he's going to do it, but he's going to make sure they're the right ones, or, whatever. And it's just this grasping assumption that it's going to be the right thing. And then you dive into it just Barely. And you find connections to, Moncef Slaoui, the vaccine czar that Trump appointed, he's a GlaxoSmithKline guy. Had money in Moderna, like made billions, or I think it was billions, on that first jump in the stock and then sold it all, right? I mean, that's incredibly dishonest. Or as well as everybody else, from Robert Cadleck in Health and Human Services. This is a usual suspect. Old school problems tying back to 9/11, Jerome Hauer. I mean, go on forever, right? These are people that are tied to his administration right now in regard to COVID-19. But the biggest one, I think, is an obvious example that should just put an end to this conversation that he is somehow fighting against this narrative or this agenda, is that the whole World Health Organization funding aspect. The idea was that he pulled funding from the World Health Organization, which technically hasn't even happened, but it's statements made. Mm-hmm. So everyone goes, see, he's fighting for us. And maybe so. But then the U.S. aid funds over $1 billion to Gavi, which is, the second to funding the World Health Organization with Bill Gates. So he's funding World Health Organization, or not he, the U.S. government. And he supported it. Everyone said, no, it's not him, it's the U.S. aid. But then they choose to ignore that 2 different times after that, his administration gave together over another $1 billion in their own, directly from his administration. So how can we argue that $1 billion going to Gavi, which is a Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation program, essentially, they're behind it, funding it. How can you argue that that's not the same thing? That funding is then going directly to the World Health Organization, So you have to acknowledge that there's whether Trump is just unaware of all of this, which is pretty damning, or he is playing his part. There's no way we can pretend that he's not playing into this, or even the Fauci part of this.
Well, let me go a little bit with what you're saying and then challenge it a little bit, because, I think that at least the people behind the scenes that run his campaign and talk to him and get into his ear, they're pretty savvy, right? In 2 weeks, Ryan, we're going to have the next level of hearings on Julian Assange. And right before that, what's he start talking about? The other most notorious person in revealing documents, Edward Snowden. And thinking about that. So now you have his base, like myself or whoever who voted for him the first time, because it's like, well, out of him and Hillary Clinton, there's really no third candidate. I'm not going Gary Johnson. And he kept saying he loved the WikiLeaks, where he literally turned his back on Assange, put out a ridiculous indictment, drug him out of the embassy, has had this guy tortured at Belmarsh and all those things. But then he's able to flip the script a little bit by saying, hey, maybe we'll look at that whole Snowden thing, right? And let's talk about another thing. He finally gets called out about Q. There's no way he could not be aware of that phenomenon at some point within the last few years. Just like in the very beginning of 2016, he leaned into Epstein. He leaned into Prince Andrew. And we all know where those things are at today, right? So he leans into Q pretty hardcore, where, he asks him, and she says the satanic cannibal pedophiles. He goes, well, would that be a good thing or a bad thing? And then after a little bit of a ramble, he goes, we are actually. So he leans into his base. He's very intelligent in that regard. That doesn't mean he's going to be able to do what he wants, or what he wants is a good thing. Now, right. I'll just say this on the other end. And when I say the predator class has such disdain for the general public at this point. They literally rigged the primaries and what was the debate system prior to all of this. So you didn't even have an anti-war voice past the first 2 debates, right? They got Gabbard out there. They loaded it with establishment people. They put everybody as a front runner at some point that they really wanted a voice right now. Grandma fucking Oatmeal still talking out there. Pete Bootlicker still talking out there. And everybody just bowed down to Biden. Biden is visibly senile. He's not the Joey B gangster of old that I've been reporting on for 15 years. He's not even fucking Sleepy Joe at this point. He's literally Zombie Joe, where if you watch that last Anderson Cooper interview, he can barely read off to the side, and he flubs up. Yeah, it's really bad. And, me taking on a puppet in the establishment, that's a lot easier. But you top that off with him having the most vicious social climber of the bunch. The woman who used her affair with Willie Brown, a guy who was in the club, a guy who got a call on the morning of 9/11 not to fly that day, a guy that is in the Bohemian Grove, a guy that ran one of the most poorly run cities in America right now, San Francisco, in the run-up to that, as the VP, as really the voice of this ticket if they get elected. And then you top that shit off with the fact they're running on a campaign of mandatory masks they couldn't even possibly get in until January. That means they've given up on the entire summer, right? They're running on a campaign of fucking mandatory masks, which means mandatory vaccinations and God knows what. Now, I ain't saying Trump is good, but I know he's not running on mandatory masks for the nation running through January on. That doesn't mean it won't happen. But to me, there is no third-party person at this point. There's no Ventura who I would disagree with a ton and I could get behind. There's no Cynthia McKinney that I can get behind. You know, there's nobody. And I really feel like, and we both know, Ryan, they're setting it up right now. I mean, this second lockdown coming to New York is to push the mail-in ballots. No matter what happens on November 3rd, we won't even know who the president is till what? December? January, possibly past that. You and I both lived through the Bush-Gore fiasco. That's going to be like this if you threw it in a dumpster fire of the LA riots in the 90s. Like, that's the only way I can describe how this will be. So, and again, like right after this, my sister finally agreed. She's coming to Iowa with me. I'm getting back to the guy that I talked to about my house, and I'm out of here by October 1st. I'm gone because the battleground of New York State, I hate to say it, but I feel like it's been lost. There is no spine. The rich have fled. The billionaires are in control per capita. There's more billionaires here than anywhere else in the world, and they're donating to Cuomo as we speak. So I guess, what is your viewpoint on where all this culminates November 3rd in the next couple of months? Where are we in October and in November? Because we're almost there.
Yeah, I think my biggest problem with this is, I mean, there's no answer. You know, the problem is that this is broken. I think even all of us, and no matter what side you're on, I think we can all acknowledge it's broken. We may just think of it differently. You know, Trump supporters will say it's broken because the Democrats won't allow anything to happen. The Democrats will say it's broken because the Republicans won't allow anything to happen. You know, I mean, there's Obama people right now for the rest of their lives that will say that he was going to change the world if only the Republicans would have let him. You know, and so even if that's actually the truth, can we not see that means inherently the system is broken, right? It's made this way to where it won't ever change, and all we do is just keep going through the motions. So I cannot get behind the idea. That's 2016 all over again, right? Well, Hillary's worse, so and I can't do that. At the end of the day, based on I guess what's the right word for it? The perceptions they're putting out about what these candidates are, right? The Biden idea, the Trump idea, which let's not pretend that translates into who they really are. Clearly, on the surface level, Biden is ridiculous. I mean, he's on its face talking about the things that we're all screaming about, like masks and mandate, all these different things. That's scary. But does that mean that that's not going to happen under Trump? Or does it mean that he'll say it's not going to happen and then it happens anyway, but he's fighting it the whole time, And it's the same. And I know that may not be the case. I'm well aware that that's my perception. And for people out there that support Trump, and I mean this more genuinely than you can understand. I hope every single day that I'm wrong about him. I hope every day that he does what they believe he's going to do. If he does it tomorrow, I will sing his praises for the rest of my life. I just don't think it's going to happen, and I'm playing that fairly. I'm watching, and I'm not trying to be like anti-Trump or anything like that. But we have to see how it's progressing. Let me ask you this: if all this happens, Trump gets elected, and it goes into this next phase, and yet it still happens, right? We still end up with these mandates because some big thing happened, and Trump grudgingly does it, or whether maybe doesn't do anything, allows the states to do it, and still says, well, he can't do anything about it, which is actually incorrect. How is that any different than Biden saying he's going to do it and then doing it, on its face? It ends up being the same thing.
Well, quite frankly, it's almost more dangerous, right? Because that's kind of the situation we got into in Syria. And to Trump's credit, he was saying in 2017, this is it. We need to get out of here. He said it 3 times in a week. And then within that week, that's when the Duma incident happens. And all of this really ties in because that was a real opportunity for him to come out and say, look, my inner circle is lying to me. That did not happen. James Mattis is a terrible person. Michael Bolton is a terrible person. And cut ties then. And that would have gained a ton. And then worked with Assange later when WikiLeaks is the only people that put out the documentation to prove it after the fact. I mean, it didn't matter that we had Pearson Sharp on the ground there, with one of the victims of the event that never happened, interviewing people on the ground that said, forget about a chemical attack. There was no attack whatsoever here. There's no type.
Right.
Our missiles were very real. And just like you said, well, he was talking a great game in 2017. Here we are in 2020. And guess what? We've still got those troops over there. I guess
Let me jump in real quick.
Yeah.
I just want to. This is an interesting note. I just noticed this the other day, and I only got to it at the very end of my show, so probably saw it. The Iraq discussion is happening again, as you can see, right? That we're going to leave Iraq. We're going to pull these troops out, and this is the same kind of point that we say these things a lot. And whether we shift those into another place, which doesn't really mean anything different, or we or an excuse happens and then we justify staying, it amounts to the same thing because they're not coming home, despite all the claims of it before. And guess what happened the same day he said he was going to move them back? We saw rockets fly hitting a green zone in Iraq. And so it's like, and by the way, we're talking Soviet-era Katyusha rockets, which are basically useless in today's warfare, that both any party other than ISIS in these areas has access to far better weapons. So we have to see it, in my opinion, for what it is. Whether that's, and I can be honest about this, or I guess I can see both sides of it, that it could also be some entity that wants Trump not to leave and did it so he would have, not have to, or have a hard time saying he wants to leave.
Yeah, no, I mean, you look at proxy forces, it's not just us using Al-Qaeda or ISIS. You obviously look at Israel and Saudi Arabia in that region that benefit from our presence. That's a very strong alliance there, and especially against Iran, which has been the most demonized in that region over the last 2 decades, especially after 9/11. And to your point that all these people say we're getting out, I want to remind everybody that in 2007, in the run-up to the 2008 election, Barack Obama, Hillary Clinton, and Joe Biden all ran on not only leaving Iraq, having a plan to get out of Iraq, but closing Guantanamo Bay. And now you've actually tricked the base of Trump and these believers in this QAnon theory that black sites like Guantanamo Bay are good and necessary, and that's where the deep state's going to go when the storm comes. And to me, yeah, that's terrible. That's Johnny nonsense, and people need to get over that because no one's coming to save you. And the craziest thing to me is when this first started, Ryan, and I was still working for We Are Change, and I started to look into this phenomenon, I said to myself, this reminds me a lot of the Nasara phenomenon that was coming around when I was working at InfoWars in 2008, 2009, where people were telling me that this government document existed where white hats were in the government and they were ready to take everybody over in this secret coup. And this literally predated this idea of this QAnon narrative by almost a decade. And now it's returned. And you're seeing Nasara and Gassara as part of this thing. And yet people are still doping themselves up with this hopium. How do we shift them from that energy of believing everything's going to be okay through inaction to looking at the harsh realities and taking action, Ryan?
It's a good question. I mean, are you familiar with a person named Drake Bailey?
No.
Somebody, the same thing, years back. And I think we wrote an article on TLAV way back then. Same exact narrative. And this is even before the one you were referencing, where he's basically just saying there's going to be a coup in the government and it's the good government fighting the bad. And, this is not new. It's kind of how these things are drawn up again, just like old political speeches we're seeing today, right? They just keep drawing them back in. And I think it's an interesting question. I think it's pretty simple, actually. I mean, look, blind faith in just about anything, let's just say in a worldly sense, is a bad idea. You should be skeptical and questioning, especially in politics today. And of course, their answer is, well, Trump's not a politician, whatever. It's like, question it. I'm not saying you shouldn't, consider it's happening. Like I said, I hope that he's going to do these things, but you should be then simultaneously asking whether it's actually happening, or even whether Trump thinks it's happening, and he's being fooled. It's the blind faith. It's the trust the plan part of it that's dangerous. What you need to do is hope it's happening, but still continue to look into it and research and ask questions. This is constantly there, and all they want. I mean, it's the same thing as Russiagate from the other side. It's trust the government, right? It's because here's the bad part of the government, but there's a good government back there, and we need to trust them, and that's the intelligence community on the Russiagate side. On the Trump to the Q side, it's the white hats, and they both ultimately make you trust the government. I mean, we need to be able to see that. So what we need in there is just a little bit of discernment. That's what we need. And I know it's really difficult because it's been evangelized. I mean, this is gospel. It's blasphemy for them to speak against the idea of what this is. And even if, let's just say, it's genuine from top to bottom, that, I mean, and hopefully people know from the past that I've covered the discussion of, from Pizzagate and before, deep into this and what's really going on there. So it's not like I pretend like that's just some ridiculous conspiracy theory. But hypothetically speaking, let's say Trump himself is leading a charge to take down the satanic pedophiles, right? The point is that at the end of the day, there's a lot of moving parts in all of this and a lot of people involved. And we just need to be able to see that that doesn't always amount to exactly what's being stated. You know, we should hope that that's going to happen every single day. Yes, please get it done. But at the same time, be willing to question even Donald Trump in this regard. But it's become an idea of a religious aspect where you can't, I mean, let's be honest. I mean, even in the Q site in particular, there's a lot of this like he sent from God. I mean, that's a common meme and a common discussion. That's a little bit scary. I mean, that is a cult kind of aspect. And you think about, and that doesn't mean there's not a lot of good people in it, but the cult aspect is somebody who is, you know, let's think of something like Nexium. You know, the idea that somebody in that would literally violently fight to protect their abuser. And then maybe wake up years later going like, wow, I mean, I didn't even realize, like, I don't know why I was defending that, you know, and that's what happens when you get wrapped into this stuff. So just caution, skepticism, discernment. It's very important.
I agree 100%. And, you know, let's transition into this, you know, parallel line of transhumanism where they're forcing you to wear a mask. They want you to be socially distant from people. They don't want you to shake hands anymore. And at the same time, they're really promoting hero worship of Elon Musk. And it's at the same time he's launching a commercialized brain chip that runs hand in hand in what DARPA has been doing for decades, Neuralink, as Starlink gets launched into the sky. And that runs hand in hand with DARPA's own satellite military program. It seems extremely obvious to me that this is an extension of that agenda. They are already talking about how these chips will be able to help with paralysis, deafness, being the blind to see. And, you know, these are things that I've covered via DARPA. It's even an Invisible Empire, the brain chip that allowed you to see back in 2009. You know, 11 years ago, they had a lot of this technology. And now it being rolled out into the public in a commercial manner where it's going to be so cool because you can listen to music in your head. And one of the most frightening aspects of this is they're almost treating it like you're going to get your ear pierced as you're going to sit down and have robotic surgery to take care of this and thread this into your brain, Ryan.
Yeah, it's. I watched the video with the pig and the whole thing, and it's. First of all, there's a lot of discussion about that actually being fake, and not that it's not possible, but that just Elon Musk is known for doing that. You know, like. Not that it's not possible technologically wise, but it's that where they maybe didn't reach it yet, or for whatever reason they wanted it to be flawless. And apparently, there's a couple times where the nose of the pig is touched and there's not any kind of response, you know, from the handler and so on. But that being aside, I think the whole scary part of this is it's alarming, the normalization of exactly the kind of thing that we're saying is being driven in by all of this. You know, the justification, well, we need this touchless society. We need the neural link, the AI, the injectable nano platforms and the medical pre-crime. And it's all this tied in this idea of creating a society where you can like eliminate danger from your life or eliminate, which is just never going to be possible. But aside from that, it's something that I think very recently, even right now, I argue if you put out some kind of a tweet about that very thing happening and then just simply link to like DARPA concepts that are literally being created now and ties to COVID-19, and people will call you fake news as they're openly posting about this happening. That needs to show us something, that the social engineering is so aggressive in this topic that, think of chemtrails in the same way. I mean, they've openly stated they're doing this now because of climate change, whatever. Yet you could actually post about it and people will be like, you're a conspiracy theorist.
Well, they're also associating COVID-19 with climate change. That's the next thing.
Yeah.
And that's always
Yeah.
been one of their moves where I've said, listen, climate change at the end of the day is not only about the control of the weather and resources, but is about eugenics and population control. And they are very open about this. And this is the Good Guys Club. This is why I featured these in my films, Invisible Empire, New World Order Defined, and Shade the Motion Picture. That's why I was so heavy on Bill Gates over a decade ago when he gets 20 minutes in Shade. I mean, this is the reality, and now you're seeing it come to fruition where they're literally now, slowly but surely inserting climate change into COVID-19, and this is going to keep happening. And it's not that it's, flattening the curve. Now it's ricocheting all throughout, and the idea, Ryan, of herd immunity, something that would come from mammals, is completely gone. Even though Sweden, if you look at their own numbers compared to other states that did massive lockdowns, let me repeat that, massive lockdowns, they had 57 per 100,000 people die. Well, look at the numbers. Belgium, 87 per 100,000 people. Spain, 62. Britain, 62. And Italy, 58. All higher than Sweden. And they all went into lockdown, and they all went mask mode. And the other aspect of this is, as they're pushing for this, they're not acknowledging there's been no outbreaks when people are close to one another and not abiding by these rules. What's been going on in Portland has been going on for months. Sturgis took place over 2 weeks ago now. That was 250,000 people that went across the country and then came back. Nothing. I attended a sporting event outside that got no media coverage with 3,500 people in Iowa. No outbreak after. No outbreak after any of the protests in New York. We're not going to see an outbreak in Belgium. We're not going to see an outbreak in London where they just had protests. And now it's all ignored. It's all ignored that there's been no outbreaks when people actually get together and are in close proximity with one another. There was no outbreak, Ryan, when the Chainsmokers had an illegal concert in the Hamptons and you could clearly see thousands of people on top of one another. No, in fact, New York's infection rate continued to go lower to 0.66%. And no one's making that association, and they never will unless we scream at the top of our lungs to do so. So how do we do that? How do we get people to say, take a look at all this and look at what's going on around you? Show me the evidence that people getting together does any less to this virus than them staying apart. Because I haven't seen that empirical evidence, and the CDC admitted back in May that they had none.
Yeah. That's a good question. That's a good point, actually. I hadn't thought about that. So there's been a lot of these protests and gatherings, that, they're allowable because they're for Black Lives Matter as opposed to COVID-19, which makes no sense as well. But it's interesting to see that they're not seeing what they claim is going to happen. And I would argue that we've had a lot of examples of places where there is high mask compliance and so on that have had outbreaks, or so they claim anyway. So that's an interesting difference there, right? But I think the problem in all of this is that people, it's politicized. I mean, literally everything in our society is politicized. Everything. I mean, it's just, we're so far past that now. And so we're at a point now where, like, I got into it with, trying to have a amicable discussion on Twitter, which is basically impossible. And somebody, you can show them the studies, you can show them the links, you can give them the information, and it's just this snide dismiss, this blithe response, like, oh, God, you're so stupid, or how do you see this? It's just common sense. And it's a block. It's like anything else. It's like trying to get some hardcore Biden supporter to see that, they support Donald Trump or something. It's just never going to happen. It's like no matter what you show them, they've already made their decision. They've dug their feet in. So now with this COVID thing, it's been turned into a political talking point for 2020. It's been turned into choosing a side. And when you get into that reality, people don't care about the facts anymore. So, I do believe that there's a middle ground in there where some people can be swayed, but by and large, people have chosen a side. They chose, look, I'm wearing my mask because I'm a good citizen and I'm going to do what's right to protect everybody else and blah, 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 despite the fact that there's 1,000 things that show you that entire statement doesn't make any sense. It's very difficult. So I think what we need to continue to do is just do what we're doing. Put the information out there and avoid confrontation about it, because people are going to choose. If they're unwilling to think past what they're being told, that's on them. And I will try to, if I bump into them, I'll try to tell them things. But the problem is that we get into these confrontations and then people just dig in further. So what I always use the analogy of planting the seed. Your friends, your family, just you talk to them, you plant the seed, you let them know what you're thinking, let them know you have information if they want to see it. And if they start getting red-faced and angry and calling you, walk away. Okay, walk away. But then circle back, day later, week later, water a little bit. Water just a little bit. Did you look in that document I sent you? Okay, back away. It's like, and you just keep trying, and that's all you can really do. It's sad, but that's the truth, I think.
And I'm trying. I really just feel like, unfortunately, and I think a lot of other people feel this way, people just want to be right. They don't care about the truth anymore. And they just want to make sure that they got the last word in and they were right all along, and they can't look at things. And every once in a while, you're right, you find, a hole in there and you say, okay, we'll take a look at this, especially when you talk about New York and just isolating people, not just for COVID 1984, but a broad range of things. This is kind of like that thing I was talking about with Joe Biden and other illnesses. All this is happening in rapid fashion without any discussion from us. And the further that we allow this to happen, like they told us, 2 weeks, right? 2 weeks to flatten the curve, to stay inside. Now we're 6+ months. And remember, all these businesses that already licked boots in my town, you watch. They're about to get shut down anyway. And New York's going to roll it back because SUNY Oneonta is the beginning of this. As soon as they get to test one, they will test all. We will have that case-demic that we're talking about, and this will be a push for more control. And that's why I am out of this mother trucker. I wish I could. I love my town, man. I love it. And it's hurting me that I'm having to do this, but I think that people need to come to the realization of right now is the time to push back in every way, shape, or form, or you're going to lose everything to these people. We really are. This isn't a joke. This isn't a drill. Reach out to your friends and family, but at the end of the day, if they're not willing to come with you, you got to find new friends and family and set up shop somewhere else. The Last American Vagabond is the website. What do you got going on there? What's the hot news that all the kids need to be seeing, Ryan?
Well, the last, right, I guess at the top there's a good interview with Ben Swan. I hope people will check out about the masks. I think at least 40 different studies are linked in there from 2020 and before. But I think the most recent was about Derek's article in regard to it's part 2 of the parasite stress theory. And I should point out as well that parasite's just the term that's used. It applies to any kind of virus or disease or anything that's used, whether or not it's real. But that's the article I hope everybody will read, because it's an alarming reality to see that our governments are fully aware of this. And you could pretend that maybe they're altruistic and maybe they, that's just a coincidence, or you could, I think we have to acknowledge that at some level, middle, top, federal, down the bottom, doesn't matter. At some level, people, even companies, are abusing the situation because of exactly that. Because this drives people to conformity. It drives people to, snitch on their neighbors and call everybody out for other things just because they're not doing what the government tells them to do. That sounds inherently contradictory to what we believe we are in this country. And that's the alarming part about all of this. And if I can make one more point about the lockdown, and I don't want this to be taken in regard to this is not a partisan point. It just is because Donald Trump is the president here, and it applies just as much to Biden and everybody else on the other side. I think that all of them are allowing this to continue. And I think that's what we need to see. And the problem for me is that the discussion here we keep finding ourselves in as well, that in Trump's specific situation, that he is allowing the governors to do what they want in their states or so on, right? The only time in history they've cared about states' rights. It's kind of a joke, right? But the point is that he should, right now, I argue, could and should stand up and tell them to stop, if that's his belief, because it's unconstitutional. That is the law. That is the highest document of the land, and he has every right to stand up and say you can't do that. Now, to be clear, if, let's say, the governor passed a bill he didn't agree with, he doesn't have the right to step in and say, no, that can't happen. But when something is fundamentally unconstitutional, which, by the way, he seems to agree with, at least his supporters think so, he has an obligation to stand up and put it down, back up, and allow the state to then continue, the people to vote and do what they want. But he needs to stop the action. If you think he disagrees with the lockdowns, the masks, then stand up and do something about it, because it is his obligation, as well as every other official, every member of Congress. You swore an oath to that document, foreign and domestic, right? The Q talks about this all the time. So recognize that and see that we need to stop this. If you want to keep pretending that maybe he doesn't know, and maybe he doesn't, maybe he's being lied to, then we still need to apply that logic to the larger picture, that on this side of that two-party system, they're still allowing this to happen. And there are Republican governors that are part of this too, right? So I just think we need to recognize that. It's very important, because as we both made clear in the show, this is going to continue. Just because you pretend your supporter doesn't go along with it doesn't mean it's not marching forward still. And that's an alarming thing that we need to stop, and it won't unless we stand up.
You're damn right. Ryan, thank you so much. We should do this again soon. I think, man, you've probably been almost 6 months since I had you on the show. Ryan Christian, everybody, has one of the best alternative media websites out there. If you're not over at thelastamericanvagabond.com, I don't know what you're waiting for. Derek Bros is just one of the many talents that you've cultivated over there. And what I love about what you do is you not only bring them over to yours, but then you promote their personal sites on top of it. So kudos to you, Ryan. Keep it up. Remember to support him. Thank you so much for joining me, Ryan. And guys, if you want to support me, you can do so over at the GoFundMe. We are fully demonetized here as harmful content. I apologize about the reverb in the very beginning of this video. I'd love to at least hit that $3,000 mark before tomorrow. Maybe we won't, but it would be great. $5, $10, $15. You mean the world to me out there. Remember, you can support me and Ryan both over at rockfin.com, ROKFIN. This is where I will be if I get kicked off completely from YouTube. Check out the documentary films, all free right now in the documentaries playlist section. Loose Change, Final Cut, Fabled Enemies, Invisible Empire, A New World Order Defined, and Shade the Motion Picture. Thumbs it up, subscribe, and share. Ring that bell. It's not about left or right. It's about right and wrong. I love you guys, and I'll see you on the flip side.